Yeah, I was going to ask you because we should have started off by maybe describing Chhaya a little more broadly,
Sure.
but this is a huge issue that you're working on and have been leading a lot of community education and advocacy efforts on in the city. Can you describe a little bit about, or actually before we get into what those efforts are, based on your experience, how common is this problem, is what I'm wondering. Is this something that is primarily happening, to immigrants, do you think, or is it beyond that, but immigrants obviously for the vulnerability of their immigration status and other issues are sort of easy targets for it?
I would say all three. Illegal conversions, particularly in Central and Eastern Queens, are everywhere. If you do a walkthrough, I actually recently did a walkthrough with a reporter going through a few blocks in Jackson Heights and Elmhurst, and I can tell you that almost every one or two family home on these streets had a converted basement that people were living in. And I can also tell you that it's very likely that those people didn't know that that converted basement was illegal and that they had to obtain pre-approval for being able to make those changes to it. So it's a huge issue. From what we've been able to tell in the studies that we've done, there are over 100,000 illegally converted basement apartments in New York City. The lion's share of those are in Queens. And I think given the city's expansion numerically in terms of demographics and also the increasing income inequality in the city, housing is just becoming an increasing problem. And in a borough like Queens, where there's not a lot of high-density, large building development that's actually happening, the only place for people to turn is often converting basements. So, and I think, again, if you look at the demographics of Queens, a lot of those folks who are kind of being pushed into those basements are going to be immigrant workers, often low to middle income ones.
And you're saying that you did a walkthrough of some of these, neighborhoods and homes. Describe some of the living conditions of the homes, because it's not just the status of the apartment, right? It's oftentimes the conditions of the apartments as well.
Absolutely. There's a huge spectrum. I've seen basement apartments that are, and we should probably also make a distinction between basements and cellars. Basement apartments or basements in homes are spaces underneath the quote-unquote ground floor of the home where there's at least 18 inches of clearance between the sidewalk and the topmost or one of the windows of the dwelling.
Right, and so that's when you see like sort of a peak of a crack, a small window peeking over the sidewalk.
And a cellar is where there isn't that 18 inches of clearance. So there's much more of the actual living space that's below ground or below sidewalk, kind of level. And so obviously, either of those situations are very prevalent in Queens. I would say that there are a lot of basements in Queens as well. And what I can also say is, so there's a huge spectrum. I've seen basement apartments that have a lot of light, that have enough clearance in the windows, that have perfectly adequate heat and hot water and space for people. I've also seen basement apartments that have very little light, not enough hot water or heat, and really substandard living conditions. So I think the issue here is that the status of the basement is so much at the whim of the homeowner.
Right.
So there's such a large variation in terms of the conditions that people are forced to live in. So, and the fact that there's so little regulation at the city as well as at the individual level of these apartments is part of what complicates the situation.
And is the distinction between basements and cellars, does that affect the legality of the unit as well? Is there different procedures to convert one or the other?
Absolutely. So basement apartments are a go for what we call legalization or quote unquote, making them kosher with the city. And cellar apartments actually have no ability, really.
There's no way to make those legal.
There's no way to make them, above board, With cellar apartments, there is actually, contrary to popular belief, there is a way that people can actually, make sure that they get approval for whatever has already been done to the apartment. And there's a process, and we can talk about that.
Great. Well, the last question I have before we get into, I really want you to talk about what Chhaya can do to help people in these situations, is my question is about tenants that are living in those units, and do they have any rights? You described a scenario where a tenant who's undocumented, let's say, or just is afraid of losing their home because they are participating in this illegal unit.
Right.
What rights do they have? Can they report their landlords? Are there other steps you would recommend that they take?
So the most important thing for tenants in these situations to know is that regardless of whether or not their basement apartment is legal or illegal, they always and still have rights as tenants. And that's, obviously the really basic rights about heat, hot water, enough light, having an access to, or an exit, having at least 2 exits. So those really basic things are not going anywhere for tenants, even if they do live in legally converted basement apartments. If somebody is in a situation where they feel like they are in a basement apartment, they absolutely can report it. They can call Chhaya. We can help them kind of figure out what the situation is with that basement apartment, particularly if they feel like their rights are being violated. They can call anonymously the city's 311 line or the Department of Housing Preservation and Development or the Department of Buildings. Any of those tips are anonymous. But it's really important for tenants to realize that if they do end up deciding to call a city agency to report problems with an illegally converted basement, it is very likely right now that they will at some point be evicted or be forced to move from that apartment. Particularly once the homeowner is quote unquote caught by the city.
Okay, so let's get into this now. So the nuts and bolts. What can let's start with the homeowners. If you're a homeowner that's been illegally renting out a basement, or what can you do to get that above board or make it kosher with the city, as you put it?
So the most important thing and the really basic first step for folks is to get that certificate of occupancy. Because that gives you an idea of what the city has in its records for the house or for the apartment building. So you have an idea of what's been approved, what's in the city's records, and what you're working with in terms of what the city is okay with. The second step, if a landlord or if a homeowner then decides that they want to quote unquote legalize their basement, is to get in contact with either a professional engineer or with an architect. Because what the next step needs to be then is either the architect or the engineer needs to draw up a set of plans for the home or for the apartment building. We can, if you call us at Chhaya, we can put you in contact with pro bono or people who are willing to do this work for a reduced rate or for free. But it's important that you have a professional who's able to actually walk you through this process and literally draw up the plans.
And your phone number should be flashing on the screen so people know how to reach you.
So that's step 2. Step 3 is once the homeowner is okay with the proposed plans to their home or to their apartment building, and that's reflected on their set of blueprints or plans that they're working with, then you need to go to the Department of Buildings and file those plans. And you have to go to the Department of Buildings to get that certificate of occupancy anyway. So it's usually a good idea when you show up to get the certificate of occupancy to kind of declare yourself at the beginning and say, hey, I know that I have, this illegally converted basement apartment. I'm working with an engineer or with a professional architect to kind of try and work my way through this process. But you should know that I am trying to work on this.
So you would advise them actually to put that out up front?
I would if they are serious about working with a professional engineer or with an architect to actually draw up the plans. And that's an important step to think about. Obviously, some pro bono engineers and architects will be able to help people, but it is a process, and there are fees associated with asking for the certificate of occupancy, filing for a permit to actually make changes to the blueprints, then filing, another kind of application to be able to have the Department of Buildings look at that set of plans and permits. So it's important for people to realize that this is a process that can take years. And it's also a process that will require people to spend some money.